Happy Sunday, everybody, and welcome to episode 25 of Origins. I am your host, Carlos Santon, as always, and we're filming tonight on a Saturday night, actually. Not my usual filming time. It's pretty dark outside. It's a cold, wintry night here in southern Ontario. Normally, I film in the mornings or during the day, but just a really, really busy day today. So we're doing a little night shoot for you for episode 25. So let's get right to it. Today we're going to talk about a seemingly dry and boring word, that word being communication. And even in the dictionary definition is rather bland. It is the imparting or exchanging of information or news. Let me give you a little bit more detailed one here. Let me just consult my notes. Always have your notes in front of you when you're talking. If you can't have a teleprompter, that is, make sure you have your notes. So here's a little bit more of a more detailed definition for you. It is the act or process of using words, sounds, signs, or behaviors to express or exchange information or to express your ideas, thoughts, feelings, etc. to someone else. So more detail there, but certainly no more interesting than the simpler definition. Now, the origins of the word communication are actually much more interesting and much more subtle, and I think but definitely worth looking into a little bit more. It comes from the Latin word communicare, which means to share. If we take the word communication and take the suffix from that word, tion, and suffixes and prefixes are the prefixes come at the beginning of a word and a suffix comes at the end, and we attach those to Latin words only. And they all have meanings. All prefixes and suffixes have their own meanings. And tion means the result of or state of. So if we were to take now our word communicare, which means to share, and our tion, which means state of or result of, our definition of that word ends up being the result or state of sharing, communication. And this is really interesting, see, because now we've taken a word that has a really dry definition, rather bland and boring, really not interesting at all. And suddenly now we've flipped it, haven't we? Suddenly communication becomes a very subtle and very beautiful kind of meaning, right? The act or state of sharing. And that is really very different than the dry modern day dictionary definition of what communication means. And it's funny, just to mention this briefly. It's funny the way that English takes words and alters slightly, ever so slightly, alters the original meanings and interpretations. And in some cases, that interpretation ends up being nicer, I think. In this case, it doesn't. I think it turns the word communication into a really uninteresting word. And I think the origins of communication, communicare, to share, are actually quite nice. And I much prefer that definition of communication, the state of sharing or the act of sharing, I think is actually quite nice. And it also happens to be the topic of today's moment of truth, which is coming right up. So if you stay tuned, we will get to this week's moment of truth, and we talk about the importance of sharing, of communicating in a relationship. And that is coming right up. And welcome to the Moment of Truth, which is our new segment here on Origins. And today, guys, we are actually going to continue our discussion of the word communication. And I wanted to maybe share with you some of my own experience and my own sort of definition of that word, and talk about that in relationship to relationships. I don't know if that's a proper phrase, but let's go with that. So welcome to the Moment of Truth. So we've heard the cliche that the old cliche about the most important thing in a relationship, and we often hear people ask that question: what is the most important thing in a relationship? And the old cliche answer, of course, is communication. We've heard that a million times, right? But if you actually stop and think about it, it is a cliche that is, in fact, quite true. Let's get into that. I actually like the definition, the original Latin definition of the word communication, which means to share. The English definition, if you look it up in the dictionary, is actually rather dry and kind of boring. It's not really an attractive word and an attractive definition. But the Latin origin of it, meaning to share, I think is quite a nice definition of communication. And if we think of communication in terms of a relationship, this idea of sharing, we can begin now to make connections and begin to see just how this cliche could possibly be so true. And I think if we're talking about sharing, what does it mean to share? What could two people possibly share? We could share ideas, we could share thoughts, we could share feelings, we could share emotions, we can share support, we can lend support, we can certainly lend a shoulder to cry on, ears to listen. We can share, stories from our lives. We can share things that are happening in the world around us, things that are happening to us and around us. We can share things we observe. We can share opinions. We can share changing opinions even, and ideas that we've thought of over time that have changed. So many things for two human beings, I think, to share with one another. And if we're talking about in the confines of a relationship, whether that be, that's an interesting word, confines. Okay, I wonder where that came from. Maybe that's not the right word, because I don't think relationships are confining at all. I think when we're talking in terms of a relationship, and this could be a friendship, it could be a romantic one, boyfriend, girlfriend, maybe husband and wife, maybe husband and husband, wife and wife, whatever the case may be. It could be a business arrangement, a business relationship, any kind of a friendship. I believe for it to be a healthy one, a productive one, a fulfilling one, needs to have that whole idea of equal sharing. Now let's think about that for a minute. Equal sharing, that means both parties sharing equally, contributing equally, and both parties being there for one another. And I think that is really the definition of a successful, happy relationship. And another thought that came to mind, I define, and this is my own personal definition, I didn't look this up anywhere in a dictionary or anything like that, or any other sort of source. I just sort of thought about it. I have a long drive home on my way home from school every day. And I do a lot of thinking if I'm not listening to some music on my way home. And I was thinking about the whole idea of friendships and relationships. And so I define a friendship, or I define a relationship as a conversation that never ends. And if we're to look at this then from our Latin definition, then that would mean it's a process of sharing that never ends. And I actually really like that definition. That's a really nice idea. As I stand here and think about it, a relationship is a never-ending process of sharing. I like that. And I like the original Latin definition of the word communication, or communicare. And I think for both people to be happy in a relationship, I think that sharing needs to be ongoing, and it should never stop. And I think we run into problems in relationships. We hear the phrase, people say this all the time actually in a relationship about, you take me for granted, or this person takes me for granted. They used to treat me better and now they're taking me for granted. And I think we can trace this back to the whole idea of the sharing does not continue. It stops. There's a breakdown there in communication, or a breakdown in sharing. And that begins to make an uneven or an unequal bond in the relationship, where one person continues to share and the other person does that a little bit less and less. And we leads to feelings of resentment and feelings of, the person is taking me for granted. So there you have it. I think I really do believe that cliche that communication is the most important thing in any relationship. we can trace that back to the idea of sharing, which is the Latin origins of the word communication. And I think without it, you cannot have a healthy relationship. So give that some thought, please. That's certainly been my experience with relationships and communication. Give that some thought and think about how that applies to your own life, and how that applies to the relationships that you have in your own life. It could be a friendship, it could be a partner, it could be, a spouse, or it might be a business thing. Because I think for business relationships to prosper and succeed, I think both parties need to benefit. And the only way that can happen, there needs to be a win-win for both parties. And the only way that can happen is if there is a good communication and a good process of sharing. So hopefully that is something positive for you to take away from today's episode. And hopefully you have good relationships, or at least one really good relationship in your life. And you have one good connection with someone where you are able to communicate and you are able to share. That is important. And if you are not willing to share with somebody, then I don't think you can claim to be in a friendship or any kind of a relationship with that particular person. You have to share. It's so important. You have to share with one another and be there for one another. So give that some thought, and we will, thank you for watching this Sunday. Enjoy what is left of your weekend. If indeed you are watching on a Sunday, we will see you next week. Until then, take care. Bye.